People have often asked me why I study so many different things. In fact, science can be destroyed by having the disciplines too thin because there's no integration. I'm not quite sure if it's reflective of my early history where I moved from place to place, but I've had a multiple interest. That is, my passion has been discovery and to pursue the unknown, and the unknown is everywhere. Well, I'm Dr. Michael Persinger. I'm a professor of neuroscience at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario. I'm associated with the departments of psychology and biology, and I'm very pleased to be a part of the biomolecular science program. I was born in an obscure peninsula called Florida, I think. I wasn't there for very long. I spent most of my youth moving from naval base to naval base along the East Coast and in the central part of the USA. And I completed my PhD at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg in 1971, working primarily with radiation physiology, since that was the great fear of the time. What would happen if we had a global nuclear war? What would be the consequences? I've been at Laurentian University since 1971, so that's what, 35 years. My daily schedule is I usually get up around 11 o'clock. For breakfast, I usually have always the same: Life cereal, chocolate chips, honey, milk, put it in the microwave, get it warm, throw some ice cream on it, warm it again. That keeps me going for the day. Usually skip lunch. If I'm not working on an article, technical article, I come to university, check the email. If I'm not teaching, then I'm engaging in research of some kind. Then I go home to eat, work out, usually martial arts. I use martial arts for exercise, the Shaolin Tzu technique, Northern China. And then afterwards I come back about 10:30, 11 o'clock, and I stay to about 3 o'clock in the morning, 3:30 in the morning, and then I go to sleep. And that's what I do 7 days a week, so it's a pretty boring life. In the 1970s and 80s, Laurentian was really a fertile ground for integration between the sciences. The students were the mavericks, and many of them still are. In fact, the mavericks often end up in behavioral neuroscience. They're the ones that are the creative ones. They don't necessarily have A grades, but they're creative, they're imaginative, and they just enjoy challenging authority, and that's what science is all about. Indeed, I have passion. What an interesting comment. Is that contradictory? I don't think so. You can have a strong motivation that's objective. I know that seems to be almost antithetical, but you can. And the scientific method is the most powerful tool the human brain has ever devised to pursue the unknown. Now, I'm talking about the scientific method, not scientists. Most scientists follow social behavior. Sadly, they make decisions based upon what they think the consensus might be. They don't challenge the unknown. Do you realize that in Canada, if you study the paranormal, if you study magnetic fields, if you study any kind of, for example, racial differences or intelligence differences, things that could fundamentally help us all, you are actually marginalized by today's science councils. And so I think the critical feature is that the scientific method is the tool by which we can cut through the nonsense of political correctness and social consensus, which is almost always based upon the loudest mouth, not the biggest brain. All experience is derived from brain activity. Your ability to love, your ability to even think that you're having a memory, it all comes from brain activity. The brain may be complicated, but it's not impossible to study. That's the great mythology, that it's beyond our understanding. No, it's not. The critical feature about our research indicates, in fact, it indicates a scientific basis to mystical experiences. In the past, people have assumed that mystical experiences were somehow a part of this mind-body dualism. You can't study them, or you shouldn't study them, which is not very scientific, is it? But this says there's a science to why people have religious experiences and mystical experiences. And we can study them. It doesn't make them wrong. It doesn't refute them. It says we can study them from the point of view of brain function. And we can understand a great deal about what stimuli produce them and the kind of people that have them. People fight and die to maintain their culture and their language. So what we asked was, suppose you stimulate the right hemisphere. What would happen? Would you have another sense of self? So when we did that experimentally, we found that most people reported a sensed presence, a feeling that some sentient being was standing nearby. And we realized, this is only 25 years ago, we realized that perhaps this is the prototype to every human brain on this planet of the God experience. Well, this is the Corin helmet after Stan Corin, who built it. It was based upon a design where we figured that the most effective way to influence the brain is very weak magnetic fields that work at the level of consciousness, the electromagnetic fields associated with consciousness, which are very, very weak. And so consequently, these different solenoids generate little teeny magnetic fields that are then generated between the temporal lobes, all right? And the pattern that's generated across will, after about 15 minutes, in the dark, with the eyes closed, produce experiences that are very similar to many, many mystical experiences. You don't need big, massive, intense fields. That's an interesting mentality, the idea the bigger the better. Nah, normally physiology doesn't work that way. So that's procedure, and of course this cannot be done without computers. The signaling, the information being sent through the solenoids, is thanks to the fact that computers have infinite possibilities of patterns. And in those patterns is information. And information does not have to be loud. It doesn't have to be ostentatious. It just has to be essential. Poets, writers, creative people, artists are remarkably sensitive to these magnetic fields and remarkably sensitive to mystical experiences. The same kind of experience that's associated with certain kinds of pharmacological agents, certain drugs, but there's no drugs here. This is simply the brain talking to itself. Think of it this way. If the brain is generating these experiences, and don't get into the philosophical argument that God created them and they have to be real, or does God exist, because it's really an irrelevant argument in this particular context. The critical thing is, if people will kill others because they think their mystical experience, their God experience was true, shouldn't we know the brain mechanisms responsible for that?
This is what we do all lab day.
I'll tell you a secret. I never work. All this stuff is really enjoyable. I find nothing more exciting than lecturing and teaching and interacting. I enjoy writing and thinking and pushing the envelope. So basically, I never work. It's always quite enjoyable. Today's topic is going to be psychotropic drugs, a handful of them. And specifically, we want to investigate the nature of consciousness and what consciousness is and how it can be modified by drugs. Now, specifically those which have political and economic impact. Now, this is a very warm room. And if you want to remove all of your clothes in order to get into a situation that's receptacle or appropriate for this particular altered state, please feel free to do so. Now, first of all, what is a psychotropic drug? Basically, it's any compound, any chemical that imitates a neurotransmitter. A neurotransmitter is the chemistry by which neurons interact. And the reason psychotropic drugs work is because they imitate the functions of those transmitters, but they go beyond that such that they stimulate certain areas more than normal. For example, marijuana, THC. Where in the brain does it localize? It localizes within the frontal region. So one of the reasons you get the anxiolytic effects, that is the effects of reducing anxiety, is because you're stimulating the frontal lobe. But also it influences the hippocampus. So, as a result, short-term memory is affected. And of course, you know how that works. Next time somebody is high as a kite on marijuana, and they're talking prolifically with that elegant and fantastic language they use, stop them, distract them, and then ask them about 10 seconds later, what were you just saying? And they probably won't be able to tell you. Certainly not after 20 seconds. Marijuana also, if you have too much ingestion, will influence other areas. The parietal regions, for example. As a result, touch feels sensual. And consequently, very often, music may seem profound. And there's still an unresolved issue. If indeed you play that record back, do you really hear Paul is Dead? Now, that's for the older people in the group who've never heard of the Beatles, all right? If you have heard of them, you know what I mean. Now, other kinds of drugs, specifically such as STP, or DOME, which is a dimethyl methamphetamine, because it localizes within the amygdala, is often associated with aggression. So where the drug is, okay, and where it localizes within the brain will influence its impact on the person's experience. So I think the critical question is to ask what the structure of the drug is in terms of its similarity to neurotransmitters, where in the brain it localizes, that is where it concentrates. And the third feature is effectively what are the dosages. Now, in terms of psychotropic drugs, I think it's important to realize that if we look at this great ravel knot, which is the human brain, and here we have a nice shot of it, we can see there's the frontal lobe, and of course if you influence the frontal lobe just a bit, you can get creativity. One of the reasons that people report creativity with marijuana is that this mild anxiolytic effect produces this kind of free association. But remember, all drugs influence maximally at small dosages, these kinds of drugs, and too much of a dosage can actually be an opposite effect, or produce an opposite effect. The temporal lobe is also involved. We look at the temporal lobe here. The temporal lobe is actually the locus for LSD effects. Most people don't know that. That if you remove the temporal lobe, there are no LSD effects. That in many respects, LSD experiences, and most of the serotonin-based psychedelics work by producing a dreamlike state and involving the temporal lobe. And the experiments have been shown that if you remove the temporal lobe, LSD just doesn't produce the experiences that occur in the normal person. So we have to know something about this great ravel knot, and I think the first thing we must know is that if we take a look at that brain, there it is, the white matter, sending information in and out of the gray area, which is the cortices, that for all practical purposes, consciousness is a closed loop. We have all this information going up into the cortex, but really, if we think at it quantitatively, only about 20% of the input to our cortex is sensory. All the rest of it is talk or interactions between those neurons, which means that consciousness is a closed loop, and sensory input is just a minor modification. Consciousness is actually created by this loop that is activated once every approximately 20 milliseconds with a phase modulation of about 12 milliseconds. That means if we change the neurochemistry within the cortices, we change the way you experience the world, we change your consciousness. So let's begin then with some of these classic ones in terms of understanding the kinds of images. Let's take a look at the consistent images associated with, here we go, mescaline, for example. Now, mescaline is actually a trimethoxy ethylamide, which means it's basically a compound very similar to dopamine. Remember what dopamine is. That's the one involved with all kinds of addictions. And there's a range of addictive capacities. Marijuana is not very addictive, LSD a bit more, and still some other drugs like opiates quite addictive, but only about 20% become addicted. So the point is that all of these various kinds of psychotropics, when you take them, go through various kinds of stages. Mescaline, so-called peyote, in stage 1, the typical experience is a grating or a lattice, cobweb shapes, a tunnel or a funnel or a cone, and a spiral. Of course, many conditions can produce this. Psychotropics can do it. In stage 2, we have meaningful images. Very meaningful images emerge. And these meaningful images can be very idiosyncratic. Then you have peoples, animals, and places. 60% to 70% of all people or all subjects report small animals or human figures that are friendly or caricature-like.